In the autumn of 1791, a farmer in Washington County, Pennsylvania, carried a jug of whiskey to the general store the way his neighbors had carried whiskey to market for a decade. He was not selling liquor for the taste of it. He was selling the only currency his farm produced that a merchant in Philadelphia would actually accept. Corn rotted on the wagon roads west of the mountains, rye spoiled before it reached a port. Distilled into whiskey, that same rye became something that traveled, something that kept, something that paid a debt. That autumn, a new federal tax reached into that jug and took a piece of it, and the men who grew the rye and ran the stills did not forget who had reached in or why. This is the story of the families who refused to pay it. Some of their names survive in tax rolls. Some survive in the record of a treason trial in Philadelphia. Some survive only because President Washington wrote them down on a pardon in the final days of his presidency. If your family has roots in western Pennsylvania before 1800, in the counties of Washington, Allegheny, Fayette, or Westmoreland, there is a real chance one of these names sits somewhere in your own line. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. The tax itself came from Alexander Hamilton, the first Secretary of the Treasury, who needed money. The Revolutionary War had left the new federal government carrying the debts of 13 states, and Hamilton wanted the national government, not the states, to be the one paying them off. In 1791, at Hamilton's urging, Congress passed an excise tax on distilled spirits, the first tax the federal government had ever levied on a product made inside the country rather than on trade crossing its borders. On paper, the tax looked even-handed, a flat rate applied to every gallon a still produced. In practice, it fell hardest on exactly the people least able to pay it in the form the government demanded, which was cash. East of the mountains, a large commercial distillery could absorb the tax and simply pass the cost along to its customers. West of the mountains, in the hill country of southwestern Pennsylvania, a farmer with a small still was not running a business in any modern sense. He was solving a transportation problem that the geography of the frontier had created for him. Grain was heavy, bulky, and cheap, and the mountain roads east to Philadelphia or Baltimore were long, rough, and expensive to travel. Distilled into whiskey, that same grain became light, valuable per pound, and easy to load on the back of a pack horse. It functioned less like a product and more like a currency, a way to pay a debt to a neighbor, buy salt or iron nails, or settle accounts in a region where hard coin rarely circulated. Nobody out there had cash sitting around to hand a federal collector on demand. The excise did not just cost these families money they could not easily spare. It demanded a kind of money the frontier simply did not use in daily life. Resistance started quietly and grew louder by the season. Farmers refused to register their stills with federal officials, which the law required. Local juries, drawn from the same communities as the accused, declined again and again to convict men charged with evading the tax. Tax collectors found their commissions torn down and posted with threats, and some found far worse waiting for them on lonely stretches of road, tarred, feathered, or simply beaten and sent home. The government's man on the ground in Allegheny County was John Neville, a wealthy and well-connected landowner who had served with distinction in the Revolutionary War. Neville was not some outside official sent to impose a foreign policy on strangers. He was a Pennsylvania-born neighbor, which made his willingness to enforce the excise feel, to the men he had once fought beside, less like duty and more like betrayal. To understand why the tax provoked this kind of anger, it helps to understand who was actually living on that frontier by the 1790s. Western Pennsylvania in this period was overwhelmingly settled by Scots-Irish Presbyterian families who had crossed the Atlantic earlier in the century, moved south and west along the Great Wagon Road, and finally pushed over the Allegheny Mountains into the Monongahela and Yogini valleys in search of land no eastern county could offer them anymore. Mixed among them were German-speaking families from the Palatinate drawn to the same cheap, fertile ground, running their own stills alongside their Scots-Irish neighbors and often intermarrying with them within a generation or two. Almost every farm of any size distilled something. A small still cost little to build and turned an otherwise unmarketable grain surplus into a product that could be carried out on pack horses over trails too narrow and too steep for a loaded wagon. In a region with almost no banks, no reliable roads, and almost no circulating coin, whiskey filled the role currency fills everywhere else. Ministers were paid in it, store debts were settled in it, it changed hands at weddings, funerals, and militia musters the way a dollar bill changes hands today. Congress and the Treasury Department, sitting in Philadelphia, understood almost none of this when they wrote the excise. The law required every distiller to register a still with a federal officer, pay either a flat annual fee or a per-gallon rate on everything produced, and keep records subject to federal inspection, all under penalty of having the case tried not in the farmer's own county, where a sympathetic local jury might refuse to convict, but in a federal district court, often a hard, multi-day ride away. For a Philadelphia merchant, this was simple bookkeeping. For a farmer 300 miles west, it meant traveling for a week to defend himself against a fine he could not pay, in a courtroom stacked against the very economic logic his farm depended on to survive. Petitions poured east, asking Congress to amend or repeal the tax, signed by farmers across 4 counties who had never before had reason to send a formal document to their own national government. Congress made a handful of minor adjustments in response and left the core of the law untouched. By 1794, patience on the frontier had simply run out, and it had run out in a region already primed by geography and habit to solve its own problems without waiting on Philadelphia. In July of 1794, a federal marshal named David Lennox rode out with Neville to serve writs on distillers across Allegheny County who had refused to register their stills or pay what the law said they owed. One name on that list was William Miller, a farmer of modest means with no particular history of leadership in the growing resistance. When Lennox and Neville reached Miller's farm to serve him, a crowd had already gathered, drawn by word that federal officers were riding the county roads, and the mood was not friendly. Miller refused the writ outright. Lennox and Neville rode off under threat, and behind them local militia companies were already assembling. The following day, that militia marched on Neville's own estate, a fortified property known as Bower Hill. What happened at Bower Hill turned a slow-building tax dispute into an open-armed uprising almost overnight. The rebels surrounded the house and demanded Neville surrender his commission and hand over his official papers. Neville refused, and gunfire broke out from inside the house. In the exchange, a militia officer named James McFarlane, a Revolutionary War veteran respected across the county for his service, was shot and killed while attempting to negotiate a ceasefire under a flag of truce. His death accomplished something months of resentment over an excise tax had not managed on its own. It gave the uprising a martyr. Within days, a crowd that had numbered a few dozen farmers grew into an assembled force numbering in the thousands, drawn from across 4 counties. The names connected to what followed are not folklore. They come from court records, militia rosters, and the correspondence Hamilton and Washington exchanged as they weighed how to respond. David Bradford, a Washington County lawyer and one of the wealthiest men in the region, stepped forward as the movement's most visible and most radical leader, calling openly for a march on the federal garrison at Pittsburgh itself. A rival faction pulled the other direction. Hugh Henry Brackenridge, a judge, writer, and one of the region's few university-educated men, and Albert Gallatin, a Swiss-born farmer who would later serve as Secretary of the Treasury under Thomas Jefferson, argued for restraint and negotiation instead of open confrontation with the federal government. Both men walked an exceptionally narrow line through the crisis. Pushed too hard against the uprising, and their own neighbors would brand them traitors to the cause they had lived alongside for years. Fail to restrain it, and the federal government would brand them traitors to the country. Gallatin, in particular, spent the worst weeks of the crisis trying to talk the movement back from an edge it had already reached, and his name survives in the historical record as one of the very few figures both the rebels and the government were still willing to listen to. Organizing much of the resistance from below, without ever putting a single named leader forward, was a body known as the Mingo Creek Association, formed out of the local militia and Presbyterian congregations around the Mingo Creek Meeting House in Washington County. It functioned as a shadow government for the resistance, holding meetings, drafting resolutions, and coordinating the men who would eventually march on Bower Hill. Its structure meant the uprising did not depend on any single leader's survival or capture, and it meant a great many otherwise unremarkable farmers, men whose names would never otherwise have reached Philadelphia, ended up on militia rolls and later on arrest lists simply for showing up to a meeting at a country church. The days after Bower Hill made clear how far the crisis had already traveled, beyond anyone's ability to control it. Word of McFarlane's death spread through the 4 counties within hours, carried by riders who stopped at every farm along the road, and by the end of that week thousands of armed men were converging on a field outside Pittsburgh known as Braddock's Field, the same ground where a British and colonial army had been cut apart by the French and their native allies nearly 40 years earlier. The symbolism was not lost on anyone standing there. Some of the men gathered that week wanted to burn Pittsburgh outright. Cooler heads, Brackenridge and Gallatin prominent among them, spent days talking a portion of that crowd down from torching the town, arguing case by case, farm by farm, that burning a city would not win a tax dispute, it would only guarantee the war. Nobody in that field was actually prepared to fight. Underneath even the Mingo Creek Association was a quieter and more dangerous mechanism holding the wider resistance together across the whole region, one that operated without any named leader at all and answered to no meeting. It signed its threats Tom the Tinker. Nobody knows who Tom the Tinker actually was, and that uncertainty was the entire point. The name appeared on letters left at the homes and mailed to the newspapers of distillers who had registered their stills or quietly paid the tax, warning them that their equipment would be mended, a term everyone in the county understood to mean destroyed. Barns burned in the night, stills were shot full of holes or smashed apart with axes and left useless in the yard. Men who cooperated with federal tax collectors woke to find their property vandalized and their names attacked in local newspapers under the same signature, over and over, until compliance itself became socially and physically dangerous. It functioned as an enforcement network with no headquarters, no membership roll, and almost certainly more than one hand behind the pen over the years the crisis ran, which made it nearly impossible for federal authorities to ever identify, let alone prosecute. Whoever wrote those letters understood something the government struggled to counter, that on a frontier where everyone knew everyone else's business, a threat did not need a face to be effective. It only needed to be believed. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. By August of 1794, the crisis had grown far too large to leave in the hands of local officials or federal marshals. Washington issued a formal proclamation ordering the rebels to disperse and return to their homes, then called up militia from Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Maryland, and Virginia, a combined force of roughly 13,000 men, larger than any single army Washington had personally commanded during the entire Revolutionary War. He rode west with the troops for part of the march himself, becoming the only sitting president in American history to personally lead an army into the field against a domestic uprising. Command of the actual expedition passed to General Henry Lee, the Virginia cavalry officer known to his men as Light Horse Harry, whose son would later be born into far greater fame as Robert E. Lee. Washington made his headquarters for a stretch of the march at a tavern in Bedford County known as the Espy House, and it was from there that he issued his final instructions before turning the campaign fully over to Lee and heading back east. When the army finally reached western Pennsylvania that autumn, it found almost no one left to fight. The men who had marched on Bower Hill and openly threatened to burn Pittsburgh to the ground had scattered into the hills the moment word reached them that 13,000 federal troops were crossing the mountains. David Bradford, understanding exactly what capture would mean for him as the rebellion's most visible and outspoken leader, fled south down the Ohio and Mississippi rivers into Spanish-controlled Louisiana rather than wait to be arrested. He would never set foot in Pennsylvania again. The soldiers rounded up roughly 150 men suspected of involvement across the 4 counties, marched about 20 of them east to Philadelphia in chains to stand trial, and largely found the entire military exercise anticlimactic. There was no battle fought anywhere along the march. There was, in the phrase later applied to the whole campaign, mostly a very long, very expensive, and very muddy walk across the Alleghenies. Soldiers who had expected a battle instead spent weeks slogging through October mud, and more of them died from dysentery and camp illness on that march than were ever killed in combat during the entire uprising. Roughly a dozen men lost to sickness and accident against 3 or 4 killed in the fighting at Bower Hill itself. It was, by any honest measure, one of the most lopsided military operations in early American history, an army the size of a small city sent to confront a resistance that had already dissolved back into its own farms and hollows before a single federal soldier crossed the Monongahela. The trials that followed in Philadelphia exposed just how thin the government's actual case was against most of the men it had marched across the state in irons. Of those brought before the federal court, the majority were acquitted outright, either for lack of evidence, because witnesses could not be produced or persuaded to travel, or because it became clear on the stand that a given man had simply been swept up in a crowd rather than leading one. Only 2 men were ever convicted of treason in connection with the entire uprising, John Mitchell and Philip Vigil, whose name also survives in the record as Weigel and as Weigel, the kind of spelling drift common in frontier documents written down by court clerks who had only ever heard a German or Scots-Irish surname spoken aloud and never once seen it written down by the family itself. Mitchell was convicted for what the court called one continuing act of treason, including robbing the federal mail at David Bradford's own urging and taking part in the burning of Neville's estate at Bower Hill. Vigil, German-born, was convicted for a string of violent acts against tax collectors carried out across 3 separate counties. Both men were sentenced to hang. Both were, by the account of the court itself, and by the private judgment of the president, who would soon pardon them, minor figures rather than architects of anything. The judge who presided over the trials, William Patterson, delivered a jury instruction that would shape American treason law for more than a century afterward, ruling that combining by force to resist a federal law counted as levying war against the United States, and therefore counted as treason under the Constitution, even without a single shot ever fired at a soldier in federal uniform. It was the first real courtroom test of what the Constitution's treason clause actually meant in practice, and the definition it produced would be cited again 5 years later in the trials that followed Fry's rebellion in eastern Pennsylvania. Then, in November of 1795, Washington pardoned them both. His own private reasoning, recorded by people close to him at the time, reads almost dismissively today. He judged Vigil to be of unsound mind, and he described Mitchell as a simpleton, a man who had followed orders rather than given them. It was the first presidential pardon granted in American history, extended to the first 2 men ever convicted of federal treason against the United States, and granted to them by Washington's own private assessment, precisely because neither man had truly understood what he was doing when he did it. The 2 men the government actually executed no sentence against were, by its own reasoning, the least responsible people caught up in the entire uprising. The men who had organized it, David Bradford chief among them, along with the anonymous authors hiding behind the name Tom the Tinker, were never brought to trial at all, because by the time the soldiers arrived, they had already run. Washington was not finished granting mercy after the Mitchell and Vigil pardons. On his final full day in office, March 3, 1797, he signed a pardon for 10 more men who had been convicted or formally indicted in connection with the rebellion, closing out the affair for good as one of the very last acts of his presidency. The names on that pardon survive in the National Archives exactly as Washington's secretary recorded them: Daniel Hamilton, William Miller, the same Miller whose farm had been the flashpoint at the very start of the uprising 3 years earlier, Richard Holcroft, Ebenezer Gallagher, William Hanna, Peter Lyle, David Locke, Alexander Fulton, Samuel Hanna, and Thomas Spears. Washington's own language on the document explains the decision in his own words, that it was ever his desire to temper the administration of justice with a reasonable extension of mercy. What happened to these men afterward is where the story stops being only about a tax and starts being about the country their descendants actually helped build. Alexander Fulton, born in Scotland and swept up in the Pennsylvania uprising as a young man, did not stay behind to rebuild his name in Washington County once his pardon was signed. He moved south into Spanish-controlled Louisiana, the same territory David Bradford had already fled to years earlier, and became a substantial landowner in what would later become the state of Louisiana, remembered locally as a founder of the settlement that grew into the modern city of Alexandria, a town that carries his surname to this day. A man formally pardoned for treason against the United States became, within little more than a generation, the namesake of an American city in territory the United States had not yet even acquired when he first fled to it. The same frontier restlessness that had put a rifle in his hands outside Bower Hill carried him, and men like him, on into the next unclaimed stretch of the continent, 6 years before the United States even acquired that territory through the Louisiana Purchase. A purchase Fulton lived to see happen from the inside. As a landowner already established on ground the country did not yet own when he first arrived there. The pardon itself is worth sitting with for a moment, because of how unusual a document it was for its time. A formal presidential pardon, issued by name to 10 individual citizens for a crime as serious as treason, was not a routine piece of paper in 1797. It was a deliberate political act by a president who understood that the rebellion had already served its purpose. The government had proven it could raise an army and enforce a law. It did not need to hang farmers to finish making that point, and Washington, in his final days in office, appears to have decided that mercy would settle the matter more permanently than punishment ever could. The 10 names on that document are not the names of men history remembers as founders or statesmen. They are the names of ordinary distillers, several of them likely related to each other by blood or marriage in communities small enough that every family on a militia roster probably sat in the same church pew on Sunday. Most of the other names on that 1797 pardon left a far quieter paper trail, which is its own kind of historical evidence. Families carrying these surnames, Miller, Hamilton, Gallagher, Hannah, Locke, Lyle, Spears, Holcroft, Mitchell, and the Vigil line, under whichever spelling a given county clerk preferred that particular year, appear and reappear across the tax rolls and land deeds of Washington, Fayette, and Allegheny counties well into the early 1800s. Some stayed put, farming the same hollows their fathers had defended against federal marshals. Others pushed on into Ohio and Kentucky as American settlement expanded past the Alleghenies they had already crossed once before, taking their names, and whatever version of the family story survived the crossing, with them. The excise tax that had started the entire crisis quietly died on its own terms not long after. Thomas Jefferson, elected in 1800 partly on the strength of frontier resentment the whiskey excise had helped stir up in the first place, repealed the tax on distilled spirits in 1802. The federal government did not attempt to tax whiskey again for decades. In the end, the farmers who had refused to pay outlasted the very law they had refused to pay. What the Whiskey Rebellion actually proved has very little to do with whiskey itself. It proved that a brand new federal government, only a few years past the ratification of its own constitution, could raise an army, march that army into an American state, and enforce a federal law without the entire experiment collapsing into the kind of chaos its own framers had quietly feared since Philadelphia in 1787. It proved a second, opposite lesson at the same time. One those 13,000 militiamen never actually got to demonstrate on a battlefield because there was no battlefield left to fight on by the time they finally arrived over the mountains. That a resistance built on anonymous threats, a shadow militia meeting in a country church, and an entire region's quiet refusal to cooperate could hold the most powerful government in North America to a standstill for the better part of 3 years without ever winning a single named battle of its own. Tom the Tinker never had a face. The government never caught him because there was never one single man standing behind the name to catch. There is also a smaller, stranger legacy that outlived the rebellion itself. Among the militia units and self-organized companies that gathered during the crisis, a banner is remembered locally as the Whiskey Rebellion flag, a variation on the young republic's own stars and stripes, carried by men who considered themselves loyal Americans even as they leveled their muskets at an army sent by an American president. That contradiction sat at the center of the entire uprising and was never fully resolved by either side. The rebels did not see themselves as revolutionaries trying to tear down the government they had only recently helped create. Many of them, Vigil and Mitchell included, had fought or had fathers who had fought in the revolution barely a decade earlier. They believed they were defending the same principle that had justified the revolution in the first place, that a government reaching too far into a citizen's pocket without regard for his ability to pay had crossed a line worth resisting. The federal government, for its part, did not see itself as crushing that principle. It saw itself defending the far newer and, in 1794, still untested principle that a law passed by an elected Congress had to mean something everywhere in the country, not only in the cities close enough to enforce it easily. Both of those ideas were true at once, which is part of why the Whiskey Rebellion has never fit neatly into the story Americans tend to tell about their own founding. It was not a clean battle between patriots and tyrants. It was a dispute between two groups of people who had all recently risked their lives for the same revolution, arguing over what that revolution actually owed the people who had fought it. The rye farmers of Washington County lost the argument in 1794. Within a decade, through the ballot box rather than the battlefield, they had effectively won it anyway. If your family history runs back through southwestern Pennsylvania before 1800, especially through Washington, Fayette, Allegheny, or Westmoreland County, it is worth looking closely at what your family actually called itself in those early tax and land records, and at the names sitting in the entries directly beside it. Miller, Hamilton, Gallagher, Hannah, Locke, Lyle, Spears, Holcroft, Mitchell, Vigol or Wiggle or Weigel, spelled however the local clerk happened to hear it pronounced that particular day in court. These were not distant historical abstractions. They were farmers and small distillers who turned rye into currency, because currency, in the form the government wanted, was the one thing their part of the country simply did not have, and who ultimately decided, when a brand new government reached into that jug for its share, that they would rather stand and face 13,000 soldiers marching over the mountains than hand it over quietly. The paper trail these families left behind is more complete than most people expect for the 1790s. Federal excise registers, county tax assessment lists, militia muster rolls compiled ahead of the 1794 march, and the surviving trial and pardon documents held today at the National Archives all record names. and often the specific township or creek a given family farmed along. Local historical societies in Washington and Fayette counties have spent decades cross-referencing exactly this material, matching modern family trees back to the men who signed loyalty oaths after the rebellion collapsed, the same oaths the government required before it would drop remaining charges against lower-level participants. A surname alone will not prove a connection. But a surname sitting in the right county, on the right creek, in the right decade, next to a name like Neville, Bradford, Gallatin, or Brackenridge in the surrounding record, is exactly the kind of thread genealogists spend years chasing, and exactly the kind of thread that, followed far enough back, sometimes ends at a farm outside Pittsburgh in the summer of 1794. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you love this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.